there's a surprising number of families where there's only one wage earner, like a lot of single parent families. Those families do benefit. You're not usually expecting a huge increase in prices, even in the extreme cases. Roughly speaking, the federal minimum is.
Do any of these kind of blowbacks of, people losing jobs, businesses leaving, prices increases, are they shown in the research? And then to that kind of what has your work shown the impacts are here?
So on the employment side, that's the first question that everyone always asks. Usually what people find is very modest effects. I would say if you sieve through all the data, all the different studies and stuff, the general tendency is either zero or very slightly negative, but not large negative. So if you raise the minimum wage 20%, you might see 1% loss of jobs, something like that range, 1 or 2% at most. Prices, I think most of the studies suggest when you raise the minimum wage, there is some pass-through to prices. There's actually still a debate exactly what fraction of the cost is passed through. So most of the time, economists think, well, the kind of pass through you might expect would be if labor accounts for 10 to 20% of the cost of the thing that's being out the door priced, then and you raise the minimum wage X percent, then X times 10% is what you should see the price go up. So you're not usually expecting a huge increase in prices, even in the extreme cases.
And you mentioned turnover. I interviewed Justin Wiltshire on similar kind of minimum wage topic, and he spoke that it actually reduced turnover in a lot of these jobs. When we saw increases, people getting paid more, they're less
Yeah.
likely to leave. Is that consistent kind of with what you found as well? And then
Yeah.
also kind of, yeah. And then similarly with hours, is there like a reduction in hours or are people keeping the same? Is that kind of studied at all?
Yeah, that people try to study that. It's the data's not quite as good on that.
Mhm.
In most cases, it's a bit dodgy. Uh, one reason is because despite all the evidence when you're walking around a coffee shop at 2 in the afternoon, everyone says they work 40 hours per week. And that obviously can't be true. So lots of times people are rounding or their mom is answering the survey for them.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different reasons why it's not very well measured. I don't think there's massive cuts in hours. Everyone always thought that might be a big thing, but it doesn't seem like such a big deal.
Just looking at maybe the whole workforce then, because obviously most people aren't making minimum wage, does this help with bargaining power for even those like median high wages, kind of just by raising the floor that minimum wage provides? Do we see benefits that kind of expand out that way?
There's a pretty interesting study by a friend of mine, Laura Giuliano, and a couple of others, and they were looking at a large retail company, which they don't name, but it's a company that has stores all over the place in malls. And they found that the managers were kind of pissed off when the minimum wage went up because their wage didn't rise as much.
Nice.
And so there is always a little bit of a concern for relative wages in at the bottom, especially natural human behavior, I guess. I had a PhD student many years ago who did a very well-known study on that guy's named David Lee. He's a professor at Princeton now. And in my opinion, his study is still probably the most credible on that. And his work suggested that there were spillovers even up to as far as the median. So it does exert kind of a subtle pressure. It's not very big because, the minimum doesn't go up that much most of the time. But his results suggested that might be true.
I did want to ask maybe one more on this, the kind of like studied benefits and stuff. Maybe the more, I guess, intuitive one that people could get to. Is it shown to reduce like poverty, wage dispersion, income inequality, these things? Are there
Yeah, yeah, for
significant?
sure. Yeah, the reductions in the reason why is because there's a surprising number of families where there's only one wage earner, like a lot of single parent families, or two wage earners that are both earning not much more than the minimum. That would be common in lots of, especially some more immigrant communities and so on. And so those families do benefit. Income inequality, wage inequality would have reductions. Wage inequality, especially.
Mhm.
Income inequality depends on hours and who works and who doesn't. And
And then there was one more idea I just wanted to bounce off of you. I didn't know if this is studied or not, or how well it's studied to that extent. And I just thought you could maybe let me know if it's ridiculous or if we have reason to believe it. But like, talking about velocity of money in an economy, like how many times it exchanges hands, is there reason maybe to support that minimum wage increases could lend itself to that? Maybe more points of taxation as money exchanges hands, you're giving more income to people more likely to spend it. That could help with demand and things. Are there these kind of downstream effects too? Is that looked into at all?
if you raise the incomes of, 5% of your workforce by 15% or 20%, they're going to have more money. And those, lower income people mostly spend almost all their income. So you do get direct spending effects on that. And that's presumably part of the way the economy adjusts to having a higher minimum wage.
Is there sort of like a, I guess, like optimal level or like a sweet spot for the minimum wage? Like, is there a number that economists are like, this is where the benefits start offsetting and maybe the risk outweigh them? Or is it more so determined by inflation? Or how is it that like the market sets, what it can handle with minimum wage, I guess,
Yeah.
to speak?
There's a bit of a literature on that. There's an economist at UMass Amherst named Aaron Dubé,
Mhm.
who's got maybe an op-ed and a paper on that point. I think most economists think that you obviously you can't have a minimum wage be, so high that employers just aren't interested in hiring workers. And in the United States, I don't think that would ever happen because if the minimum wage got too high, people just wouldn't pay attention.
Right. Yeah.
When we have crazy laws, a lot of times we just don't pay attention, kind of like the way drug laws used to be. It's important to keep in mind 15 or $20 an hour isn't very much in California, but it's a lot in Mississippi, Iowa, even. So really the point where the minimum wage starts to be likely to be a binding constraint and further increases would definitely lead to offsets and job growth. Where that is probably quite different in different labor markets.
And actually, that kind of goes into it. Might answer what my next question was going to be, which was kind of these regional differences. From like a policy, I guess, standpoint, you often hear, it'll work in big city New York, but it might not work in rural Indiana. And as you kind of went into, both with the benefits and then the possible negative effects, is there big kind of differences regionally, or is that kind of over exaggerated, or how much should that be taken into consideration?
Well, roughly speaking, the federal minimum is quite low.
Mhm.
And most of the states with higher wages and higher incomes have their own minimum wages, in most cases, quite a bit above the federal minimum. But for the most part, the lowest wage parts of the country, sort of down the center of the country, would be the ones where the federal minimum is holding. And so for those states, the minimum is currently, relatively low, hasn't been raised for a very long time.